Imagine this. It's 2:37 a.m. You've been staring at the same blank document for hours, its cursor pulsing like a metronome, counting down to some invisible deadline. Your throat tightens. Your chest hums with a low electric dread. You know what you need to do. You've known for weeks. But instead, you've binged documentaries about Antarctic explorers, reorganized your sock drawer by color theory, and fallen into a YouTube vortex titled, "What Happens If You Drink Nothing But Coffee for 30 Days?" Each click, each distraction, feels like a tiny rebellion, a middle finger raised to the void. Yet here you are, hollowed out by the weight of what you've avoided, as the clock ticks louder, as the shadows grow teeth. Here's the paradox. You are both the prisoner and the warden. You crafted the deadline. You designed the task. You alone hold the keys to your freedom. So why does it feel like you're shackled to a sinking ship, watching your own hands betray you? Why does the voice in your head, the one that swears this time will be different, sound like a stranger? Procrastination isn't laziness. It isn't a lack of discipline. It's something far darker, far older. A silent civil war between the self you pretend to be and the self you fear you are. Let's peel back the layers. You tell yourself, "I work best under pressure." But when the pressure arrives, you crumble. You swear tomorrow's version of you will be wiser, stronger, better. But tomorrow's you is just today's you, wearing a different mask. You've turned time into a villain, productivity into a god, and yourself into a heretic. The guilt is familiar, almost comforting, a scab you keep picking. But beneath it lies a question you've been too terrified to voice. What if you're not avoiding the task, but what the task demands you become? Consider Nietzsche's warning. Beware that, when fighting monsters, you yourself do not become a monster. Procrastination is not your enemy. It's a mirror reflecting the parts of you that refuse to play along with the lie that you're infinite. That time is a resource to exploit, not a truth to surrender to. Kierkegaard called this the dizziness of freedom, the nausea that comes when you stare into the abyss of your own potential and realize you must choose what to carve into it. But what if you're afraid of the sculptor you'd have to become? What if the masterpiece requires a self you don't recognize? This is the great haunting. You don't procrastinate because you're broken. You procrastinate because you're terrified of the unedited version of yourself that might emerge if you finally began. The version that doesn't need excuses. The version that could fail gloriously or succeed unforgivably. The version that renders every past iteration of you obsolete. Stay with this discomfort. Let it gnaw. Let it crack open the platitudes you've been fed about productivity hacks and mindset shifts. This is not a problem to solve. It's a symptom of a deeper existential fracture, one we've all inherited, yet no one dares name. In the next section, we descend into the underworld of this fracture. We'll confront the psychological specters and philosophical forces that engineer procrastination, not as a personal failing, but as a rebellion against a world that demands you sell your soul for the illusion of progress. The truth is closer than your next breath. But first, you must ask, what are you really protecting when you choose to stay stuck? You sit at your desk, but your mind is elsewhere, lost in a labyrinth of half-formed regrets and futures that flicker like static. The deadline looms, but you're no longer present. You've split into two. The you that frantically Googles how to stop procrastinating, and the you that watches, paralyzed from some dark corner of your psyche. This is not an accident. This is by design. Schopenhauer called it the will, the blind thrashing force beneath all human action. We are not rational creatures, he argued, but marionettes jerked by unconscious desires we dare not name. Procrastination, then, is not a failure of willpower. It's a mutiny, a revolt against the part of you that has internalized society's cult of productivity, that equates worth with output, that treats time as a currency to hoard rather than a mystery to inhabit. You delay because, deep down, you sense the lie. What you've been taught to want is not what you need. But here's the twist. Your rebellion is also your prison. Carl Jung warned of the shadow, the exiled parts of ourselves we bury to fit into civilized life. Procrastination is your shadow hissing through the cracks. Every time you choose TikTok over the task, you're not being lazy. You're enacting a ritual of resistance against a world that demands you shrink into a cog. But like Prometheus chained to his rock, your defiance feeds the very system you rage against. The algorithm rewards your distraction. The economy profits from your guilt. You are both the dissident and the fuel. Nietzsche's eternal recurrence asks, what if you had to relive this moment, this exact struggle, infinitely? Would you crumble? Or would you finally ask why you've turned your life into a rehearsal for a performance no one is watching? Modernity sold you a myth that you are sovereign, that every choice is yours. But Sartre's bad faith whispers the truth. You've outsourced your freedom. You've let calendars and KPIs and LinkedIn influencers draft the terms of your existence. Procrastination is the scream of a soul drowning in inauthenticity. Viktor Frankl, surviving Auschwitz, wrote that those who have a why can endure almost any how. But what happens when your why has been colonized by empty metrics? When your goals are ghosts dressed in others' ambitions? You procrastinate because the path before you is not yours. It's a script written by parents, algorithms, and late-stage capitalism's cult of busyness. The task itself is not the enemy. The enemy is the erasure of your inner compass, the quiet death of asking, who would I be if I stopped running? Even biology conspires against you. Your brain's amygdala, that ancient sentinel of fear, registers unfinished tasks as threats. But instead of fight or flight, you freeze, a deer in the headlights of your own potential. The prefrontal cortex, seat of reason, is overruled by the limbic system's primal mantra, avoid, number survive. You've been conditioned to confuse safety with stagnation. Aldous Huxley's Brave New World haunts us not with overt tyranny, but with velvet handcuffs, distractions so pleasurable we forget we're imprisoned. Your procrastination is not a flaw, it's a diagnostic. A fever signaling that you've ingested a value system that poisons you. You scroll, you binge, you delay. Not because you're weak, but because you're trying to vomit up the lie that you must earn your right to exist. But the clock ticks, the guilt metastasizes, and a terrible question begins to rot in your gut. What if you're not wasting time, but being wasted by it? In the next section, we'll trace how this silent civil war corrupts relationships, corrodes creativity, and births a society of spectral selves, always busy, never alive. The consequences are not what you've been told. They're far more intimate, far more human. You've seen the enemy. Now prepare to meet its casualties. Picture this. You wake at 3 a.m. years from now in a house that feels like a museum of someone else's choices. The job you settled for, the book you never wrote, the love you didn't fight for, they hang in the air like ghosts, whispering what if. You rise, walk to the mirror, and meet a stranger's eyes. They're tired, resigned. The kind of tired that doesn't come from work, but from the weight of paths untaken. You suddenly understand. Procrastination isn't stealing time, it's erasing you. This is the silent genocide of potential. Every time you defer a decision, a tiny death occurs. Neurons that could have forged new pathways atrophy. Relationships that might have bloomed wither in the realm of maybe next week. Creativity starves on a diet of someday. The brain, wired to conserve energy, clings to the status quo like a life raft. But the raft is sinking, and you've been taught to call drowning comfort. Let's dissect the carnage. Cognitive biases are the invisible architects of this decay. The sunk cost fallacy chains you to dead-end projects because you've already invested so much. The planning fallacy tricks you into believing tomorrow's self will be a superhero, until tomorrow becomes today, and you're still mortal. Worst of all, present bias addicts you to the dopamine hit of now, mortgaging your future for fleeting hits of distraction. You've become a taxidermied version of yourself, preserved in the formaldehyde of later. Neurologically, you're fighting a rigged war. Each scroll, each "I'll start in 5 minutes," strengthens the neural grooves of avoidance. The basal ganglia, that primal engine of habit, hardwires procrastination into ritual. Meanwhile, the prefrontal cortex, the seat of you, is overrun by the limbic system's primal chant. This is fine. Stay small. Survive. You're not weak. You've been ambushed by a brain that evolved to avoid saber-toothed tigers, not existential fulfillment. Culturally, the trap deepens. Society glorifies busy as a sacrament, empty calendars as moral failures. You've been conditioned to confuse motion with meaning, productivity with purpose. The philosopher Byung-Chul Han called this the burnout society, where we exploit ourselves willingly, chasing validation in likes and promotions. Procrastination, then, isn't laziness. It's a perverse form of protest, a refusal to play a game rigged to replace living with performing. But the protest is suicidal. You starve your own dreams to spite a system that doesn't notice you're gone. Heidegger warned that we're thrown into being, forced to craft meaning in a world that didn't ask for us. Procrastination is the cowardice he described, the tranquilizing of the they-self. You let the they decide, the amorphous crowd of societal shoulds, while your authentic self retreats into a labyrinth of Netflix and snack breaks. Camus saw the absurdity, humans desperate for meaning in a silent universe. But what's more absurd than choosing the void? The casualties are everywhere. Friendships reduced to stale texts, careers flattened into paychecks, passions fossilized into Pinterest boards. You collect hobbies like grave rubbings, tracing the outlines of lives you're too afraid to live. Even your memories blur. When every day is a rerun of avoidance, time collapses into a featureless smear. You don't have a life. You're haunted by one. But here's the secret no one tells you. The system wants you stuck. A population pacified by procrastination doesn't revolt, doesn't create, doesn't ask dangerous questions. You're kept docile on a drip feed of distraction, your rebellion neutered into complacency. Huxley's prophecy fulfilled, a painless concentration camp where you lock your own cell. The clock ticks. The mirror's stranger stares back, and a feverish thought claws its way up your throat. What if this is the last tomorrow you get? In the next section, we arm ourselves for insurrection, not with apps or hustle porn, but with a radical reclamation of what it means to be human. The path is treacherous. It demands dismantling gods you've worshipped for decades. But the alternative is that museum, that mirror, that ghost. You stand at the edge. The weight of unlived years presses like a stone on your ribs. But here's the secret they buried under self-help cliches and productivity gospels. You were never meant to manage time. You were meant to ignite it. The rebellion begins with a heresy. Stop trying to fix yourself. Procrastination isn't a bug in your system. It's a smoke signal from your deepest self. Jung's shadow isn't your enemy. It's an ally in exile. Nietzsche's Zarathustra didn't descend from the mountain with a planner. He came screaming, Become who you are. This isn't about discipline. It's about divination, excavating the self buried under societal shoulds. Let's weaponize your avoidance. In 19th century Japan, samurai practiced wabi-sabi, the art of finding beauty in imperfection. Apply this to your procrastination. Next time you're paralyzed by a task, ask, what does this resistance reveal about what I truly value? The answer will terrify you. That report you're avoiding? It's not the work you dread. It's the identity it demands, the obedient drone, the sellout, the traitor to your creative soul. Your procrastination is a compass. Follow it to what's alive in you. History's great rebels mastered this. Van Gogh's painted Starry Night not despite his madness, but through it. Kafka wrote in the gaps between office drudgery, turning bureaucratic hell into existential art. The Stoics, Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, didn't fight distraction. They cultivated focus as an act of defiance against Roman excess. Their tool? Memento mori. Remember you must die. Not as morbid fixation, but as liberation. When death becomes your advisor, later loses its power. Here's your arsenal, the anti-to-do list. Instead of tasks, write down what you're willing to sacrifice. Every yes requires a no. Want to write the novel? Cross out being liked by everyone. Crave freedom? Burn the shrine to productivity. Micro-rebellions. Channel the French resistance. When the Nazi occupation banned jazz, Parisians played it in basements, encoding messages in saxophone solos. Your version: work on your passion project for 7 stolen minutes a day. Email yourself ideas during bathroom breaks. Let the system think it owns you while you smuggle your soul to freedom. Sacred selfishness. Philosopher Simone Weil wrote, "Attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity. Redirect that generosity to yourself. The next time guilt whispers, you should be working, hiss back, I should be living." But beware, this path demands blood. To rebel is to embrace what Keats called negative capability, staying in mysteries without irritable reaching. You must tolerate the vertigo of creating before you're ready. To write shitty first drafts, to risk looking foolish, to love imperfectly. The Japanese concept of kintsugi, repairing broken pottery with gold, applies here. Your cracks aren't flaws, they're proof of survival. Display them. The ultimate act of defiance? Define your own measure of a life. When Susan Sontag wrote, "I write to define myself, it is an act of self-creation," she revealed the alchemy. Procrastination dissolves when creation becomes existential oxygen. Not, "I write because I must finish a book," but, "I write because otherwise I cease to exist." This rebellion isn't solitary. Every act of courage sends ripples through the collective unconscious. When you refuse the productivity cult, you give others permission to breathe. When you choose depth over hustle, you starve the attention economy. When you exist fully, you become what David Foster Wallace called the anti-ghost, someone so vibrantly alive that others remember their own pulse. But the clock ticks, shadows lengthen, and a final truth whispers. This isn't about time management. It's about soul management. In the final section, we confront the ultimate mirror, the realization that will either shatter you or set you free. The choice, as always, is yours. But know this: what comes next cannot be unthought. Here is the secret they've tried to bury since the first human carved tomorrow into clay. You do not procrastinate because you are broken. You procrastinate because you are a god in rehearsal. Every delay, every hesitation, every gut-churning moment you stare at the void between intention and action. These are not failures. They are ancient rites, the friction of a soul grinding against the raw ore of its potential. Franz Kafka knew this. He wrote, "You are the problem. Don't look for the solution in the stars. You are the solution. You are the knife plunged into your own flesh to stop the bleeding. Let this truth detonate in your bones. Procrastination is the price of existing in multiple dimensions. You are the present self, clinging to what's safe. You are the future self, screaming from the horizon. You are the ghost of every version in between. The tension isn't a flaw. It's the forge where identity is hammered into being. Consider the sculptor. Before the chisel strikes, there is terror. The marble block is perfect in its possibilities. One wrong strike, and the vision collapses. So the artist hesitates, paces, stares. This is not cowardice. It is reverence. Procrastination, at its core, is the human condition. We are mortal creatures trying to carve infinity into finite days. No wonder we freeze. No wonder we ache. But here's the alchemy. Your avoidance is the raw material of transcendence. When Kierkegaard wrote of anxiety as the dizziness of freedom, he revealed the sacred function of your struggle. That knot in your stomach when you face the blank page, it's not fear of the task, it's fear of the portal, the threshold between who you are and who the task demands you become. Every meaningful act of creation requires a death, the death of the person who began it. This is why myths across cultures feature heroes who descend into darkness. Inanna stripped naked in the underworld, Orpheus turning back at the cave's mouth. You are both myth and maker. Your procrastination is the underworld. Your task is the threshold. The moment you begin, truly begin, is the moment you let your old self burn. But society calls this wasting time. They're wrong. Einstein rewrote physics while daydreaming at a patent office. Darwin procrastinated on the origin of species for decades, collecting beetles and breeding pigeons. Mary Shelley conceived Frankenstein during a stormy night of ghost stories, avoiding real work. What the world dismisses as avoidance is often incubation. The subconscious, left to wander, solves problems the conscious mind chokes on. Your laziness might be latent genius fermenting. The ultimate truth? Time is not linear. It is alchemical. When you procrastinate, you're not avoiding work. You're wrestling with chronos, clock time, the tyranny of seconds, to reclaim kairos, the eternal now where art and meaning are born. The poet Rilke called this living the questions. The Buddha named it samsara, the cycle of suffering that becomes enlightenment when faced without flinching. So here is your paradigm shift. What if procrastination is not your enemy, but your oracle? It shows you where your soul and society's demands diverge. It highlights tasks that demand your surrender to a larger self. It screams, this matters enough to terrify you. The solution isn't to vanquish procrastination, but to decode it. To ask, trembling, what version of me waits on the other side of this task? And am I ready to bury who I am to meet her? In the end, we all face the same reckoning. The writer Joan Didion confessed, "We tell ourselves stories in order to live." But here's the darker, brighter truth. We procrastinate the stories that would force us to live. So let the cursor blink. Let the canvas stare. Let the unwritten future pulse like a second heart. Then breathe and step into the fire. Because this is the final, most dangerous freedom. You're not late. You're not early. You're exactly where you need to be. At the edge of a beginning that will end you. The clock was never your master. It was always the clay. Now begin.